רוצים להתחיל הרצאת האורח. יהיה באנגלית, כמו שכולכם יודעים, למען העיקרון ובשל הימצאות המשאבים יש תרגום למי שזה יעזור לו, ואפשר לקחת אוזניות עם תרגום בחוץ. We are honored to have Professor Peter Lindert, a distinguished professor of economics from UC Davis, here in Jerusalem. Professor Lindert was today our guest of honor during the third annual conference of the Economics and Society program at the Lindert Jerusalem Institute. The program's stated mission, objective, I quote, to participate in and influence debates on social and economic policy with a focus on such pressing questions as inequality, the labor market, social welfare, health and education, and macroeconomic policies. The idea is to examine alternatives to current economic policies, which will be based on achieving sustainable economic growth in ways that will promote the well-being of all citizens and greater equality within the society. End of quote. Professor Lindert's research addresses exactly these kinds of issues and has made seminal contributions to them. Those who know Professor Lindert's record will agree that his work is very closely related to our objective. Professor Lindert's publications, monographs, books, and many professional articles deal with diverse topics, mainly in the fields related to economic history. In 2004, we published an important book, which we covered in our first newsletter. For those of you who want to see it, it's on our site. Growing Public, Social, Spending, and Economic Growth since the 18th Century. It's in 2 volumes, Cambridge University Press. Growing Public has been awarded the 2005 Ellen Sharlin Prize for Best Book in Social Science History, and is also a co-winner of the Georgi Ranki Prize for the Best Book in European Economic History in 2003 and 4. Before, in 2004, published a book, Shifting Ground, the Changing Agricultural Soils of China and Indonesia, by MIT Press. It's good. Among his many articles, the last few years, I will mention only 3 recent ones. One with Professor Williamson under the title, Does Globalization Make the World More Unequal?, published in a book edited by Bordeaux, Kylo, and Jeffrey Williamson, Globalization in Historical Perspective, 2003. Then Voice and Growth, Was Churchill Right?, Journal of Economic History. And the last one that I will mention is 3 Centuries of Inequality in Britain and America, in a volume edited by Atkinson and Bourguignon, Handbook of Income Distribution. Those who followed Professor Lindert's productive research efforts over the years are struck by his consistency, rigorous writings, and ability to use modern methodologies to clarify old-fashioned arguments. This is really a unique characteristic of Professor Lindert's approach. Thus, he manages always to argue with both the right, quote-unquote, and the left, quote-unquote. Professor Mוצקין, Gabi Mוצקין, the head of the Lindert Jerusalem Institute, was here this morning, congratulated us, but had to leave and had some urgent businesses in Europe, so he went for a day. And he sends congratulations and welcome to all who are here. Tonight, in the 3rd annual conference of the Economics and Society program, we are privileged to hear Professor Lindert on welfare states, markets, and efficiency. The free lunch puzzle continue. Please, welcome.
My great thanks to the Institute for this opportunity and to Arie for all the organizational help and his conversations so far. I think 100 years from now, an economics and society program will be discussing the exact same issues. These issues will not go away. And that's for a very simple reason. They are so important, and they are so driven by self-interest, the debate. People will go on inventing opposing arguments on these questions forever because they have a self-interest incentive to do so. That's been true for at least 200 years, we know from the literature. On these issues, society goes back and forth between common poles of argument that we've been reading about for centuries. What makes them go back and forth is a little bit the facts, but mostly just the political mood of society. What could we do with a debate that is guaranteed never to end? Well, the main thing we can do, I think, in our work is to shoot down bad arguments so that the bad arguments are weaned out and at least society knows how it is reaching a position between poles of left and right on the basis of acknowledged facts. I'm trying to supply some of those in this work, and for me, my work on it continues, just as the title says, this puzzle continues. Let me get into it right away, starting, as I know I always should, with the conclusions, so that later on, as I may drift one way or the other, at least you knew what I was trying to say. There are 6 of them. These will be covered on the exam. Okay, first, if you didn't know this already, the high-spending areas within major countries and the high-spending countries with high taxes are not an endangered species. There is no clear race to the bottom. Second, the big one that is featured most in my title is what I have called the free lunch puzzle. And it has this very specific meaning that you can see on the screen. That is to say that the higher spending countries within the OECD community have achieved greater equality of income over these recent decades. And relative to the problematic American system, they've achieved slightly longer lifespans at zero cost in terms of GDP. That zero cost item is the welfare puzzle. I will be a little more cautious about what I mean by the zero as I come to it in my comments. There are pluses and minuses that balance out in the welfare state versus a more free market, low spending kind of economy. And similarly, if you're trying to think of those geographically across the Atlantic, there is a kind of a balancing of mistakes, a balancing of policy mistakes. We all make mistakes. We can either make market failure kind of mistakes or government failure kind of mistakes. For most of history, before the subject matter of my talk, there was no particular contest. It was obvious that government failure mistakes were bigger because governance is what made the world backward and pathetic for so much of human history. But in our privileged little corner of these 2 centuries and 30-odd countries, now there's more of a balance in the mistakes, and that's what I'll be arguing. In terms of balancing, let me try a little bit to rearrange the relationship of the mic to the computer that I have to reach for. Just a second. Okay. So, to amplify with numbers 3 and 4, that balancing has its 2 sides. And first, I will be arguing about the kinds of policies for which the welfare states and big governments perform better. And you can see on the screen that I have in mind in particular health care and health insurance, promotion of women's careers, and a much better tax structure that goes ahead and taxes addictive, what I will call addictive products. You'll see what I mean. Okay, and on the other side of that same balancing act across the Atlantic, Western Europe has made relative policy errors that the North Americans have not made, including too much protectionism against competition on a broad front. Job protection laws will be featured in some of my remarks here. And until the mid-1990s, they over-regulated industry, and it took them a while to get rid of some of the nationalized industries that they didn't really need, and the over-public higher education at which we were hinting earlier this afternoon. Those problems are severe in parts of Europe. So watch the geography, and I will be careful with my terminology here. You'll hear me talking about welfare state versus free market economies. You'll hear me talking at times about Europe versus America, but in particular, let's be sure to watch the north-south distinctions between Europe, because many of these difficulties are much more prevalent in Mediterranean Europe, and these difficulties, I will emphasize again and again, do not relate to the welfare state as either Beveridge or I or most others would define the term welfare state. They don't relate to general safety nets. They relate to other specific protections for interest groups. Okay, what people will say, and I will come to this again in more detail later, is, you know, okay, I can accept the growth evidence that a person can accept the growth evidence that I and others have presented to the effect that there is no obvious differential in growth performance based on whether you're a large welfare state or not. So far. But could it not be the case, a person might fear, very legitimately, that the 21st century will be very unlike the 20th? Can the computer come over? Okay, I'll just do my best. Okay. Because in the 21st century, it may be that all of this is about to be dismantled because we have a crisis in age-related policies like pensions and medical care. Maybe that which has worked well now will stop working well in the future. Okay, thanks. Okay. Oh, this is... Okay. And I'll argue that that is an avoidable issue. It's not an issue that is specific to the welfare state. That won't be the locus of any difficulties in the future. In fact, we have already seen from the behavior of certain countries in the 1980s and 1990s exactly how they will be adjusting pensions. I'll focus on pensions, not the medical care here, in the 21st century. They will basically have to, there will be no choice, but to have a relative shift away from generosity of old age-related benefits. But they can achieve that without any real absolute pensions. Some countries have already been making moves in that direction. But they have to make some changes, as you'll see. And as you probably knew already. And then finally, back to a much larger chestnut, the trade-off between equality and efficiency. You know, I must be the 271st author to say that that's not necessarily true. I will certainly come back, and that will be my theme here, too. I will have a different way of saying that, that I think may add to the debate. Okay. I will use some definitions. If I talk about welfare state, I have a particular quantitative definition in mind, and it's based on the concept of social transfers, defined as you can see in the paper or on the screen. And it's the usual familiar candidates minus a couple. So in my concept of social transfers, I will not include, and I tried to take out in all of my measurements, the public pensions that are paid to public employees. I don't consider these as interesting for those of us who want to debate redistribution. Because basically they are just the usual kind of pension deal as part of the wage package between employer and employee. The employer happens to be the government in this case, but I don't see interesting redistributive issues. And when I think people get excited about talking about how Social Security might be reformed, I don't think they have this in mind. I think what they have in mind is just the more redistributive kind of programs. And it turns out that in making that definitional choice in this work, I was defending myself in advance without knowing it very well against a possible misunderstanding that you could have in developing countries. In many developing countries, what looks like a large Social Security budget is basically just perks for judges, military officers, and the top civil servants. So I'm very glad I left all that out. Definitionally, my welfare state will use a 20% yardstick as a share of GDP, and that has the rhetorical convenience that it makes my set of welfare states correspond more or less with what the journalists were calling welfare states. Education is not in this definition. It's a separate discussion because it doesn't have the same redistributive properties as welfare, public health, and some of the others that I do want to discuss now. And another proviso you can see there. Okay, now, my first point was no race to the bottom. There hasn't been any particular change since 1980 in the number of countries that really would qualify as welfare states. 1980 is an appropriate benchmark because that is Reagan and Thatcher. And it was felt that since then, everything would be dismantled very quickly on the welfare state front. And as I commented at some point in a footnote, there have to be at least 15, 16 books with a crisis or a collapse of the welfare state in their title. And I think it's very good coverage for something that didn't happen. I think it's been covered rather well. In fact, there's been almost no change in the membership. Most of these countries have continued on their paths. The Americans on the one side of the fence, the Nordics on the other, etc. With these slight changes, Ireland sort of dropped out, especially if you measure Irish social transfers as the share of GDP. Now that has a particular importance for Ireland. In economics, we've basically forgotten the difference between GDP and GNP because what difference does it make sort of thing, and it just bores the students. But basically, for Ireland, it makes a lot because much of what is Ireland's GDP, which contributed to the supergrowth and the seeming decline of their welfare spending share, is in fact a rise in the incomes earned in Ireland by Intel and the others, and it's not actually the Irish as you would have thought of them. But they did drop out. They didn't cut anybody's absolute benefits, but they did drop out in this measure. Switzerland joined in, and Switzerland has always bothered me in this work. It's the case I just can never understand well because I read German, and the Swiss data are a nightmare with all the cantonal relations and the fiscal this, that, and the other transfers, and I can never figure them out. But when presenting these issues in Switzerland, I asked both in Bern and in Geneva, what exactly has been happening here? And they can't quite say either. We just know that the medical expenditures and the pensions have just really gone on growing, even though they are not the most rapidly aging country. Switzerland, for mysterious reasons, is checked in. And you could add to the number of welfare states if you wanted to keep democratic as an implicit adjective in welfare states, as I always do. So by becoming not communist, these few Eastern European countries that I have on the screen here have protected their safety nets fairly well. Other FSU countries have not, but these three have kept their welfare and other payments pretty well intact while becoming more democratic. So, no race to the bottom. Let's get to that free lunch puzzle. And let me on this screen just talk a little bit about what is the econometric side of the work. And as often should be the case, when all of the identification is done and the statistical work is done, you usually wind up with a conclusion that you could have seen in the raw data in the first place. And, in fact, you can. Just take any raw correlations of dozens of countries, several decades, etc. Imagine different correlations of interest to you, and you'll find there actually never was a negative correlation between the share of social transfers in GDP and economic growth or level of income. There never was. And some past estimates had already begun to say so. I wasn't the first. Joel Schlemmerod, Easterlina Rebello, others had begun to get such results. And I felt that the kinds of statistical work I did made the tests more appropriate to the exact issue. And I again get a null result with some, a confidence interval. I can't tell you that the effect on GDP per capita of the welfare state package is exactly 0. Could be negative, could be positive. But clearly the notion that it's 0, what I've been calling the free lunch puzzle, rests very comfortably right in the middle of the confidence interval. I have taken the procedure of putting my data out there so that people can say, oh, you ran the regression wrong. Well, if I ran the regression wrong, there's the data, you do it. Now, this is one of those opportunities that comes along from time to time in economic history where you can actually surprise people with that result, even though some other scholars were beginning to show this statistically already. And the reason is that the public discourse on this, certainly in North America, had gotten very far out of line. Out of line because one particular side of the argument was well-funded and used ridicule as a debating technique and really overdid its arguments, really was bluffing seriously. And it doesn't take too much of an economist to see it at some point when the bluff gets really big. So if you're wanting to think about how I did this econometrically, etc., please accept my assurance that the main thing I feel is that the target had become so big, the target that, if you'll just cut tax rates, it will cure cancer, improve your love life, bring world peace, etc. I mean, that had gotten so far out there. And the left was so weak in this particular debate in recent times. Not that previous generations of leftists didn't use ridicule as a technique. But in this particular case, the argument had gotten way out there, and those of us who are empiricists know how to spot a bluff when we see it. And that's what we were actually looking at in this case. What you see as evidence is not. And let me show you this quick tour that follows of 5 rhetorical devices that are used to make the welfare state look bad by bluffing. Okay, the first one, what I call empirically starved models, sort of the anorexic theoretical models. And this is actually probably the most frequently used. How many times have you seen an economist say, I have found this, or my other friend economist has found this, or shown this. And then when you read it, it's a steady state growth model, or some other just vast theoretical exercise. And to show that it works empirically, they will run a computer simulation. Now, I have qualms about calling computer simulation a factual exercise. But that is, in fact, what most of the literature is. It is of that nature. Second, guilt by definition. This, again, shows you the kind of work that you get, not from the real scholars, not from the best scholars, but from the funded, what you might call hired guns, who work on this area, sort of somewhere between academia and the press. So consider, for example, the well-funded Economic Freedom Index that comes out of Simon Fraser and has several funds contributing to its updating every year. Now, in the Economic Freedom Index, 1/5 of the weight, and the first item mentioned, is basically big government. Big government and high statutory tax rates, whether they were paid or not. These count as a loss of economic freedom. And if a March's 10 were here, he might well ask the question, freedom for whom? There's got to be a gain of freedom for somebody who gets the benefits of these programs and the extra human capital they can help develop. But it's in the definition as being very bad. So if you have large government spending, you will look bad. So Israel does not look good on this definition, on this index. But if you will find what makes Israel not look good, it's all that first component. Israel defends itself, and it's very expensive. And this makes Israel look like a country without economic freedom. Another example, having a large shadow economy, where people are not reporting things and doing informal economy kind of activities, is supposed to be another sign of, it's supposed to be anti-freedom. This is a different study now. This is more European-based, not that first one. It's anti-freedom because, oh, isn't this a shame? Isn't this terrible what taxes are doing? If you have large taxes like a large VAT, people will engage in a lot of activities to evade it by engaging in informal sector transactions. The funny thing is, that would make the big tax states look better if you really thought about it, because what you're saying is there's other productive activity going on that is not in the measure of GDP. And it's particularly big for the big tax states. They tell us. Okay, well, if that's true, look at the upshot. Okay, third, another device. Who's in the sample? So here's a case where now the scholars giving us the sample that's most often used here are not guilty of what I'm going to go on to talk about. It's others who use their work to comment on the debate about the welfare state. You can use you can make big government look bad if you have a sample where big government doesn't have a particularly pro-growth kind of look. And the sample that has been used for this is the very useful Barrow and Lee sample of economic growth since 1960. And it does show that there's a big negative effect of large, what they call government consumption. By the way, it does not include social transfers, so it's actually not even on the topic here. But large government consumption does seem to have a negative effect in these global cross-sections on economic growth. Why? Well, for one thing, it includes Israel in the sample, and national defense is a big item here, and other things equal, the way they're measuring economic growth is not going to be promoted by it. They can't answer, of course, the counterfactual, what if Israel didn't have the national defense? But that gets into affecting the overall results. More interestingly, perhaps, governments that are kleptocracies are in the sample. So the samples include Chad, Zambia, and Zaire. Okay, and lo and behold, government consumption spending in these countries is not good for economic growth. Other scholars will not be deterred from going on to say that that shows you what could be wrong with big government and the welfare state. And you can see that if you want to comment on Sweden, having Chad in the sample is not the most direct route. Okay, and then there's comparison shopping. So this will be really at the journalistic fringe now. The scholars will do this only a little bit. Let me shop around. Let's see. Suppose I represented labor unions and I wanted to say, okay, I'm going to go around and find a time period where the high-spending welfare states grew faster than the low spenders. Got it, no problem. I'll do Denmark versus Switzerland, or Austria versus Switzerland, or either of them versus New Zealand. New Zealand, with its Washington Consensus complete package, is growing more slowly, and some of the others, ta-da, QED, welfare state is good. That's scandalous behavior. If you were to do that, usually it's done with the opposite intent. America's a rich country, low spender, QED, that sort of thing. It's not hard, but as I say, just look at the whole set. History gives us so much. There's so much information out there. Don't throw it away. And then finally, the fifth one, I see a tax wedge. Now, this is a vast literature. Pioneered by Martin Feldstein in his earliest work in the 1970s. This is not all of his early work. He also did econometric work, etc. But here, the genre here is socially responsible. It's a good literature. You just have to be aware of what's the empirics here. You read the laws and you find, wow, there's some tax rates there that, when you think of how the actual complicated tax system works, it actually puts potentially large marginal tax on extra effort. Okay? It does that. True. And then you'll go on theoretically to say, I think, the elasticity of labor supply could be -1, and look at the amazing deadweight cost that this implies from this tax system. But you've done some things wrong there. You made an extra jump on the basis of the theory. Empirical studies don't show that kind of large response. And in any case, this literature has, in this I see a tax wedge version, the same defect that many of these other kinds of devices have, which is because you're not actually using the data, because you're making, and you're really looking at the tax side alone, you've implied that the government wastes the money, right? It just all goes down a rat hole. In the best tradition of this literature, they don't say it's all frittered away in cronies' parties. Rather, they say it's just given back as a lump sum. But that's, you're just missing any possible external benefits, etc., of the way in which the government money was used. You would make the reverse error if you just said, oh, I just want to study the distribution of benefits, and you let that word benefits make you imagine that it was never paid for by taxes. Be symmetrical on all this. And the tax wedge literature is not symmetrical. Okay, now, if I say that you get something near a zero result, there ought to be some economic reason as to why. And that's right. First of all, point A here is obvious enough. The real world welfare states don't really commit the blunders that most of these parables describe. That is, they do not say to a school leaver, if you don't feel like working and would like to play your guitar, here's 70% of your wage for the rest of your life. It never happened, okay? That's a very important point. They don't do it that way. They always have these conditionalities on the assistance, etc., these term limits, etc. It never worked quite that way. Okay, and they are actually more sophisticated about their mix of tax types and spending types, as you can see me mentioning once again. Particularly, to see the possible role of the tax mix, let's consider, this is your first exam question, multiple choice question. There's two in the paper, and I'll only do this one here. Which of the following tax rates is not higher in the big government welfare states than in, say, the United States? And you can see on the screen the four choices. Basically, soaking the rich and taxing capital and corporations versus labor versus consumption versus the sin tax. Sin taxes, the last. Correct answer A. That is what is not higher in any Nordic welfare state than in the US or Japan. The other rates are higher. And the tax rate on labor income is higher, where labor income means everything from income from everything from janitors to physicians. Excuse me. General consumption, the sales tax, the VAT, etc., is higher, and definitely higher in the welfare states than in the United States or Japan. And do I know that that's good for economic growth? I think it might well be. But I'll have to play a little trick here. Aside from somebody else's work published in a journal, there's not actually any econometric demonstration that the consumption tax is superior to some of the others that we use. But my device rhetorically for the moment is this. Conservative economists have always wished we could have the consumption tax, the VAT, etc., because they would like to get away from soaking the rich, taxing income, taxing corporations, etc. And if you poll American economists, as was done in the 1990s, they say, yes, this would definitely bring a gain in economic growth. So really, I will pivot on their opinion here. They say it's good for economic growth. Isn't that interesting? Who's doing it is the welfare states. Quick pause here to give what I think is a great political economy of this kind of issue, the VAT. America doesn't have it, okay? And I have heard a great comment attributed to Larry Summers. He hasn't owned up to this, but many people swear they heard him say it, about the VAT. I don't know if you know what Larry Summers on the subject of the VAT. He says, the VAT is very unpopular in the United States because the Democrats fear that it's regressive and the Republicans fear that it's a money machine for big government. Someday, the VAT will be very popular when the Republicans realize that it's regressive and the Democrats realize that it's a money machine for big government. It's a knife-edge political economy. Different countries come to it or not. I think Larry got it about right. And then sin taxes on these addictive products that have bad environmental and health effects, gasoline, alcohol, and tobacco, are bigger in those countries. Okay. Now, a quick disclaimer. Is it not the case, Leah's experiment did not get this result so much, I don't think, but that's okay. You know, when you add up the whole sum of experiments from different countries, is it not the case that unemployment compensation really makes people work less or slower to accept the new jobs? The general literature usually often says yes, and I got some of those results too. But even when you get that, the effects on GDP are small. They would logically be smaller in percentage terms. And the past discussions have just imagined too much about that. But throw that into the bundle with all the other effects. And so now in my sort of transatlantic comparison or parts of Europe comparison, let me look first at this side. Excuse me. The side of the balance of mistakes in policies, which first finds the welfare states with an advantage over the USA. Now note that the phrase here is the welfare states, and this is the northern half of Europe in particular. First, public health is America's Achilles heel. It just happens to be a particularly bad social sector in my country, as you know. And if you know, when you've spent your year in the United States and faced the issue of health insurance, it's quite a wake-up call as to what that costs. The U.S. insurance system has more bureaucracy, higher administrative costs, and saves fewer lives. Now, let's see, I have to pause here to put in something that the paper has at this point. So there are some fair demonstrations about the determinants of differences in life expectancy between countries. The Americans are peculiar in having not as good a life expectancy by 4 years as Japan, and most of the European countries are better than the U.S. in that respect, and so is Israel better, as I recall. So, and there have been good studies of that cited in, by my paper for you to that effect. They don't show you that the difference in the healthcare institutions and the health insurance institutions are the reason why. They show that it is a small and significant part of the story, and that's really what I'm going after here. But I must put in the disclaimer here that for the United States, there are many other reasons why the Americans don't live as long as most OECD countries. Bacon double cheeseburgers, double latte, Krispy Kremes, firearms, you know, there's quite a few. And all of these habits of life are quantitatively more important than the healthcare system's deficiencies. I don't want to exaggerate that, but that is my point. It is part of the story. The Americans got trapped by their history. A little bit of it is that they get trapped by free market ideology. Okay, thanks. But it's not as simple as that. It's actually a story of how first back in the 1940s and 50s with some wage control, strange incentives in World War II, and with some tax rulings of the 1950s, in America your healthcare insurance got tied to your job. And that's been a very illogical and fateful move on the Americans' part. Because if you lose your job and have to get a new one, the new plan may turn you down because of a prior condition, like you had something happen to you before. And that's a trap. We are in that trap. It also creates an extremely strong lobby against any reform, because there's an entire industry designed to sell these plans to the employers. We are they're also trapped by Medicare in the following sense. In 1965, when they set up our socialized medicine for the elderly only, the American political process, you know, probably gave us something very inefficient in terms of saving lives. We have made medical care of all kinds extremely costly for those under 65 by having this kind of runaway subsidy to the elderly, for whom the expenditures can't save that much life, that many years of life. Okay, support for mothers' careers in Northern Europe is well known to you, I think. Basically, the generous parental leave and the subsidized infant care, etc., these have the effect that is, on balance, clearly strongly positive. There could have been a negative effect on the competitive position of employers, some claimed, but basically that seems to be outweighed by the fact that career continuity is so promoted for parents, emphasis mothers, that human capital has accelerated as a result. Okay, let me, I find those fascinating issues, but let me carry on with some others. Advantages USA over Western and Southern Europe. Note, I've switched the geography again. Competition in higher education, U.S. system versus the Italian system of higher education, for example. Western and Southern Europe in particular has the employee protection laws, and on this issue I go with the conservatives and sort of the OECD Washington consensus on this particular issue. And I'll show you a reason why. I and a co-author have a particular way of saying that we think these prove to be costly, because it's not always true that if you have these stiff protection laws you can show that it raises unemployment right away. It doesn't work quite that way. It works a little bit differently over the long run. Here's how it works. First, at any particular point in time, you have some countries that have strict employee protection laws, anti-firing laws and the like, protecting the senior male employees, basically. And Greece and Italy will be my examples here versus Ireland and Denmark. There is my co-author's restrictiveness index of employee protection laws in the middle column. On the right, what is the relative unemployment rate for youth? And these youth will be anybody in the up to age 34. I think we're in these. No, I think this is 15 to 24 in this data. Okay, much higher in the countries that have those protective laws. What that means for the youth is that they have to spend a significant share of their lives queuing up, not yet getting the on-the-job training that's more important even than the formal education in many cases, and living in their parents' home and not getting on the real job where their skills and pay advance. That's what's happening in Greece and Italy here. And the same thing is true for women. Women are also shut out for a long time. Lindbeck and Snower are very correct in emphasizing the insider-outsider relationship in European employment, especially in these kinds of countries of Central and Mediterranean Europe. In that situation, there's a long delayed effect, negative effect, of these kinds of protections on productivity. Because when these laws are first set up in the 1960s in Italy, for example, there's not an immediate net loss of jobs, because some people's jobs are protected by this and others are kept on the outside, but there's no particular obvious net effect. But when you go a generation almost later, you're getting to a labor force where a very high share of people have spent their careers on the outside before getting in. So the delay effect has accumulated in their human capital formation on the job. Okay, now let me move a little faster with this part, because I think it'll be easy for this audience to see where I'm going. The pension crisis, will it in fact be the case that in the 21st century we have a crisis that the welfare state escaped in the 20th? And it's a disaster. A country that has a really bad demography, like Japan or Italy, is in trouble. Terrible demography. They live forever. They have no immigrants. They have no kids. Perhaps I exaggerated a bit, but you get the general idea. And by mid-century, these will be the two oldest countries in the world, I think. They're being chased by China and Singapore, who is going to have much the same problem. Second way to get into this kind of pension trouble is you could ask for trouble. You can cater to what is the luxury nature of retirement, etc., with actual policies that encourage what turns out to be low-income workers, low-earnings workers, to retire early. And so Italy gives you almost an offer you can't refuse. If you're unskilled for all your career and you're now 54, 55, etc., you've got to take this deal and retire. It's so good for the unskilled. The professionals don't get the good deal, but the unskilled do. And that's asking for trouble. These people are going to live so long. And the third way you can get into trouble is just to have a big overall government budget deficit. Because in the end, whatever technicalities they put on reserve funds for pensions, etc., it's all part of the general government budget, one way or the other. It's all the same political decision. And if there's a general budget, that's going to be trouble for pensions. Emphasis Japan, who has been doing its homework and lengthening out to a later age, the time when you can get your full benefits. The United States also running a deficit because of the tax cuts of 2001, 2003, Iraq, etc. Okay. I want to stress that for a nation to grow older gracefully, you've got to face these issues. It absolutely is true that something must be done. The people who write with scare tactics on this are correct in their basic premise. It cannot be the case that the pensions per elderly person can rise as fast as income per worker. You've got to make that adjustment. And on the screen, I put it in terms of a certain support ratio. Pensions per old person cannot rise as fast as income per employed person. It just can't be because of what you know is happening to the share of the population in the two age groups. So you can either raise the age of full benefit retirement, as my country is correctly doing, Japan has been doing, or you can make sure the benefits do not get indexed to wages so that they can rise much more slowly than the wage rate. Various techniques of that sort. Some countries only have to make relatively small pension adjustments. There must be a vast literature on Israel's pension crisis, but I think you're in the small adjustment category, like the United States and other immigration countries. Compared to the ones that I've mentioned, you don't have the problem as seriously as they do. Norway and Sweden don't either, basically because they had elderly populations in the 1980s and did their homework and did what I'm trying to describe we will all have to do. They've already moved there. Continental Europe is in more trouble. I want to stress, though, that this is not, the way it's often presented, a problem with pay-as-you-go public pension programs. It's not a problem specific to pay-as-you-go, where the young of today pay for today's elderly's retirement, as opposed to their own. And it's not specific to public programs versus private. This is just basic demography. If you're going to live longer and longer, and you want to keep retiring before 65, work it out. If you had if there were no such thing as a pension program, and you simply did your own savings, the same result would obtain. You have to cut the per annum consumption all your longer and longer life in relationship to your wage. That's simple math. You have to. And so it's not really about something that's wrong with the public programs. And politically, if you look at the history of this, Bismarck, U.S. Social Security, and others, what you'll find is that you can reform and decide we want to go back now to a defined contribution kind of plan, which sounds good. I mean, I would choose it if I were starting from scratch with a new nation. But historically, it's very hard to get pre-commitment on this issue. And in fact, U.S. Social Security morphed into pay-as-you-go, so did Bismarck's system very quickly, etc. And I've already mentioned the lower point on the screen, which is that many OECD countries have already shown the way toward trimming the rate of growth of pensions. Okay, and then finally, Let's go back to that general chestnut, that overall large issue about the trade-off between equality and efficiency. It's an argument that you will like if getting people to back off inequality gives you a better deal. And that's been the tradition. As I say, self-interest is what guarantees this debate will be perennial. But in fact, there's no real need to do that. And it's not just that I have some statistical analysis, it's also common sense. Ask yourself, now you know political history. Here's your reality check question. Now give me a country and a time period where that country did everything anybody could do and implemented every policy which would make incomes more equal and promote extra economic growth. I don't think it's ever happened. And I have a little diagram for those of us who need our diagram fix in economics. This diagram here shows you what I mean here. Efficiency on the vertical axis, equality on the horizontal. Nobody's out on the frontier. If we were out on that frontier, you would have to choose between the two. And it's usually portrayed that way. No country is on the frontier. We know politics too well to believe that. Even in my example, Sweden is not on the frontier. You might have thought Sweden is as efficient as a country can be with that much equality. Not really. They could have gotten rid of their agricultural subsidies, all of which go to well-off landlords, things like that. That would have brought a slight efficiency gain, a slight equity gain. The United States and others are clearly within the frontier, for the simple reason that the politics of interest groups always keeps you back there. So that is easily set aside just on common sense grounds. So the final screen, which I will leave up, is this very nice quote, I think, from Alberto Alesina. He who abandoned Italy and its higher education system for Harvard, and I think he summarizes it rather well. From a European perspective, you don't have to follow exactly the American model. The American model can go on living forever, but you don't have to do that. You can have an intelligent mixture of market competitive forces and the safety nets and the human capital investments that modern society needs. You can have that, and the Northern European countries, he feels, have done so. And that's my thought, too. Thanks.
What we plan to do is free Shachar from holding I'll do it by moving this. The rest of you are most welcome to comment, to ask questions, to agree or disagree, as you wish. Who is the first pioneer? If you can, say your name. If you want to ask in Hebrew, we can do it, but it will be easier.
We make this distinction between welfare states and free market states. But I think when you look at the national accounts, they can be very misleading, because you can have government intervention without actually observing higher taxes and higher government expenditure. To give you an example of this healthcare thing that you mentioned in the US, I think it's actually a counter-example, because the way that healthcare in the US is being pursued is actually the opposite than the free market standard American one. So the same thing is true about the pensions and about all kinds of employee contributions that are mandated by the state. So I think looking at this kind of comparisons using national accounts data on tax revenues and spending can be quite misleading. And the question is that maybe there is a better way to look at the state intervention versus free markets, and not discussing just ratios of 20% of GDP in terms of government expenditure.
Sure. That's right. If your topic was government intervention, then it's exactly as you said. There's all these interventions that are not of the budgetary type. There are all the rules. And I think your question also meant that there are other things which perform the insurance function, which are not regular government budget type. Also true. Also true. I simply, large as this topic is, I had to choose certain limits on it just to keep it manageable. And I knew when going into the project that the controversy centers over that which visibly relates to taxes. And I just felt that the best way to make a major contribution was to focus on that budgetary side. It's much more difficult to say what the effects of all kinds of government regulations are. Those are harder to quantify. And they are in the debate, but they're certainly not more central than the taxes and give-outs that I did focus on. So I'm comfortable with my choice on that. Now, you mentioned health care, and can you give me an example of the kind of thing missed here that would have been a health care policy that would be very important for, like, redistribution?
No, what I had in mind is that you can have state intervention in a direct way, and very transparent way, by raising taxes and then having government expenditure or redistribution programs. Or you can have government intervention simply by regulation,
yeah,
in a way that creates exactly the same distortions, but they don't get counted in the national accounts.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Okay, my main point is that even if you prove that large taxes and large government expenditure does not have a negative impact on GDP or on growth, it still does not prove that government intervention does not have a negative impact on growth of GDP.
And some of my examples were of legal interventions, if we want to call that government intervention, like the employee protection laws, which do have a negative impact on GDP. I just separated from the welfare state with what I thought was good effect. Absolutely. And I would be delighted if one of the main effects of my having done this kind of research would be to get somebody else to go out and say, I'm going to go quantify the effects of the antitrust interventions and all this other meddling on GDP, and if I would feel very pleased if that were the outcome. I'm waiting for that literature because they have a harder task. Those measurement issues are not as easy.
Please.
שמואל פניאל. Tulman, first of all, I feel that your talk was delivered to the wrong audience.
Because?
You should deliver it to the treasury and so on. According to our
you may be my messenger.
I'll do it.
Okay.
Number two, I feel that the United States, after World War II, was very close to welfare and efficiency. They had this GI Bill, the finance mortgages, and the Marshall Plan and so on, and there was a tremendous growth. So it was very close to this optimum.
It was. Those particular, we can stop and think about this, but those particular vast amounts of expenditure were well spent, for sure.
1 second. איציק גלור.
איציק.
In the area of higher education, which I think is part of the European welfare state, you prefer the United States. I mean, part of the welfare state in Europe. Now, and the reasons you mentioned were two, if I followed correctly. One is competition, and the other one is the private market. Now, The United States perhaps is not a good example for some of the reasons that you mentioned when you excluded some other countries. A, it's big. So competition is easier even compared to England or even Germany. Secondly, the non-state universities are in fact not really private. The good ones are funded by philanthropies. So it's kind of private-public, which you don't have in other countries. I mean, cannot compete. You know. And lastly, this has to do with the remark you made this morning, the product. If you don't have good competition, the product, which is usually the degree and not learning, creates a market failure. And this is something that public funding of higher education can prevent, at least as far as quality is concerned. So I wonder if you would like to comment on that.
Could you give me a clarification on the... Well, so let me answer the first part first.
Okay.
You said I did mention two things, competition and public versus private. Let me collapse those into one, as part of my earlier presentation tried to do. The public-private mix issue is not crucial. Competition is crucial. If you had public agency, publicly funded or even publicly run universities, which competed a lot against each other, that could work. Britain is trying to do it that way with its RAE, the Research Assessment Exercise and things like this. It's a bit formulaic, but actually it works okay as something to keep them awake and producing. Unfortunately, it doesn't relate to the quality of teaching. But then, in the later part of your remark, something else that I'm not see. Quality. You were saying we need the public sector involved somehow to assure quality.
Yes, because the product is not a degree. You have a market failure in places that have to be supported just by tuition, for instance, and you don't have any funds coming from the outside.
If you had a degree mill which produces this piece of paper, combined with no particular learning, and suppose it's a private enterprise, is that the fair sort of thing? We have those. We have those too. But you know, the system does sort of work. You can get your degrees online. By the way, you can get ordained online as a man of God these days too. You know, the opportunity's out there, but the system is smart enough. My feeling is on the issue of higher education, they know what that's worth. And so, if it was just a degree sheepskin, if it was just signaling, in that narrow sense of the way the term that was used earlier today, that would sort itself out. People would say, you know, this didn't really teach people much, from what I've heard from about the alumni from this place, and I'm not going to value that very highly. So I think the system is a little bit savvy and a little bit smart about that. In the United States, I should mention, by the way, another competitive aspect that I failed to mention earlier. Well, one thing that's good about their education system is a pair of things. First of all, we don't screen too early with high-pressure exams that come early in life, like Britain's old 11 pluses were one of the worst, that sort of thing. You can't shut people out at any particularly early age. And the Americans are good in not doing that. So, in America, it isn't quite the case that if you just get the sheepskin from the top place without learning a thing and partying the whole time you were on campus, it's not quite the case that you just get a great reward and a job with the cronies and, you know, the in-group and the best firms. We don't have these otikal, we don't have the, you know, Keio and Tokyo University kind of syndrome where once you made it, you made it. You know, and then it's time to just relax because you'll be assured of a good connection. The Americans have avoided that trap. The Americans also, I should have mentioned, have a particular virtue in their economic competitive system that they very much need. The virtue is catch-up education for adults. Okay, now America needs this. because our junior high and high is pretty weak, and we have a lot of people that just don't get serious about studies, and school is boring in high school in America, etc., and they just kind of drop out. Emphasis males do this, quite a bit. But our system has the chance for you to come back at, say, age 34, and say, okay, I'm ready. I'm going to get my degree now. And those returning students, many of whom I've had, are very serious. They know exactly what they want to get. They're like MBA students. Okay, now you've got to give me this material, kind of thing, and they really shake it out of the system. I think they're free in that competitive environment from having the degree be just this piece of paper and a signaling ticket without any actual writing. I'm not actually that worried in their case.
Okay.
I have a question concerning the how should I put it, the heterogeneity level of society.
Yeah.
Does your result are constrained by heterogeneity? I mean by religion, cultural, etc.
Yes, very much. And I said so in my treatment of this topic, and so more recently have Alesina and Glaser said this kind of thing. A society that is more heterogeneous is less capable of using the public sector for efficiency and equality together. Because in the more heterogeneous society, in their heart of hearts, the people in the middle of the political spectrum and the people in the middle of the income ranges say to themselves, this public program will take my tax money and give it to them. Them being these other groups. And that's a killer. Not all heterogeneities are equal. Race in America is a particularly, as Glaser said in a chapter in the Alesina Glaser book, race in America has a particular meaning that other, like diversity of immigrants, etc., doesn't quite have. And it's a real killer of public goods. And many scholars have shown this. Alesina and many co-authors, and Easterly and others, Bakir, have shown that either internationally or within a country, you will not do things collectively well if you're a really heterogeneous nation. It's the downside of the diversity. The upside is terrific. I mean, I love the diversity and I love welcoming immigrants, etc. The downside is your public sector doesn't function as well.
And are there any interesting ways in which countries
With this diversity?
manage to deal with this diversity?
Yeah. Let's see. Now, there is an upside, which is the private sector often benefits from the diversity. Because, the more groups, the better the chance that a couple of them are terrifically entrepreneurial and will help pull up the society a lot. You've seen that in many countries. So there is an upside, but the downside is you don't use the public sector as well. Seems to be the statistical result.
Yeah, a follow-up question to clarify that last point.
But wait, she's going to want you to have the mic.
The microphone?
Listening to translation.
I have a very okay. Just a follow-up question. When you say won't do well, I thought you were saying that there would be a less willingness to use the public sector, for example, for redistribution. The middle class, the middle pays the taxes less. Is that? But that's well. Is the difference in willingness and efficiency? So, could you elaborate on that?
I was putting many things together in a short phrase. There is, I think, an efficiency loss because in the more heterogeneous societies, you don't come up with public health working as well. India would be an extreme case, where you have a public health system and it's a disaster. Because they won't, they're just not willing to fund it well enough. Similarly with primary education in many countries. The U.S. would not be an example of what I'm saying here, but it's, there are efficiency improving public spending types that they don't do enough of because they are too heterogeneous, yes.
Yes, you were talking about mostly about how the Scandinavian countries, for example, are efficient in designing the tax system so that the incentives will be okay, but you did not speak about the other side, the side of the benefits. How do you design the government in such a way that it will not have a dead weight loss? And I was wondering about that because if we just think about it like economists, then the dead weight loss of the taxes are going to be larger, the larger the tax burden. And then the benefits on the margin are going to be lower and lower. So theoretically, isn't there a limit to the size of the government where it is no longer good?
Oh, yes. First, the final comment, that's easy to answer. You bet there's a limit. There has to be a limit out there. And really, the point was these the larger spending, larger taxing countries are not stupid, and they know the limit. There's a great debate that the Swedes have, just to illustrate that, which the Swedes had a debate about this in the 1940s and 1950s. And this is how they got the VAT, basically. There's a great story told by Sven Steinmo, a Swedish economist at the University of Colorado, where he put together this political history for you quite well. The economists in the SD, the Social Democratic Party, wanted to be able to launch a huge system of public health and pensions. It would be hugely expensive, they knew. They thought, what taxes could we levy to raise this? They said, there's no way that we could tax business and large corporations. They would flee. They said this in the 1940s and 50s, so this is rather prescient, I thought. They will flee. We can't do this. So we have to have a general consumption tax. It later became the VAT, but it was a regular consumption tax at the time. They presented that to the Prime Minister, and he agreed. The problem was to keep the coalition together because they were backed by the LO, the Blue Collar Labor Organization that is so huge, and they were also in coalition with the communists. And they carefully, and the conservatives, you could float the idea of a consumption tax by the Swedish conservatives, but they at that time were not interested in any case. They didn't want to hear anything with the word tax in it. So basically, they called the communists bluff. And they said, we're going to do this because we need these programs. The communists were furious, had some demonstrations, and then backed off, and the coalition stayed. And on it went. And that became ramping up to become the VAT that we now have as their centerpiece. So they knew about it at the time. Yes, that you can make a mess of it, and there's got to be some limit to the amount of tax you can do wisely. They figured out about where that limit is. Earlier you said, aren't there serious issues on the expenditure side for getting the institutions designed right? Absolutely. You need to make these cash transfers to people conditional. The recipient has to be part of society too. And part of their membership is they've got a responsibility as well. So, two quick examples of how that works. By the way, it does work this way in Nordic settings, though my examples will not be Nordic. It's how you can understand how Denmark can have these, what look on paper like incredible taxes, and people just keep going to work. It's in the design. The angel is in the details, so to speak. Now, my two examples. First, a favorite example, the Brazilian and Mexican case of conditional cash transfers, and now called oportunidades in Mexico or Bolsa Familia in Brazil. I love it because my daughter is a monitor of the latter program in assistance to the Lula government. They design it the right way. They give a cash transfer if you're poor, and at the latest cadastre they found your family was poor. even if your conditions change, the data don't change, and so you actually still get the grant. But they will give a cash transfer to mama, note mama, because the studies have shown, this actually matters to what the family does. Yeah, but only on conditions, and there's this constant thing, and I've been in the villages watching the bulletin boards in the villages, and they're checking on people. They have a real monitoring system. You haven't presented your documentation lately showing that your child is in school, the child is getting health checkups, and got the vaccination round for this year, sort of thing. That's kind of, this is the deal. We're making a deal with society for the sake of the long-run effects. Another example, in the United States, the two main changes of the 1990s that worked well. First, EITC. It's in the paper, but I took it out of tonight's talk. The earned income tax credit for specifically low-income earners gives you a much better incentive to take on that initial boring, low-paying job so that you get on the career ladder. And they won't take away your welfare benefits as much because of this. That's a good move. And the Americans also, in the tough love economic reform of welfare reform of 1996, they put on the term limits, for people, for a certain percentage of welfare recipients. The right will run out. That's a certain percent. And the state has discretion over some people they could keep on welfare longer. But basically, that is sort of right. I mean, it's just a way of communicating with the recipients. You are part of this, deal. We want you to get a job, develop in some other ways, in exchange for continued benefits. Get the details right, and really the Nordics did. Though my examples were not Nordic.
Will you be ready to comment on the state of the debate on the welfare state in the U.S. now?
There is no debate about the welfare state in the U.S. Let's see, did I say that correctly? I'm going to think about that. It's pretty much a dead letter. I mean, the Americans will never be one. It'll never happen in the United States. The countries have their you know if you know any of the history of this, right? All change is incremental. Some huge shock can bring a big change. Humiliating defeat in war or something like that. But basically, these things go incrementally. These paths will never cross. It's actually a serious problem with the international panel data that I and others have dealt with, which is how could one of these countries ever become the other? It's not, how would Sweden become Japan or Japan Sweden? There's a serious historical causal issue there. The Americans will never change.
Yes, we have 1 and 2. I think that we are. Yes, please. You need it. You can talk.
I'd like to ask you, with all your experience, there are some countries that claim that that have received aid from America, that they've actually have given more to America than they received in the form of a brain drain, such as India and Korea. Korea's gotten this and has gotten a lot of them back. Also, India's gotten some back. Israel has lost more, has more economists in the States per capita than any other country. In fact, for the size of Israel, there are more academics in America than from any other Western countries. How would you, if you were asked to be an advisor to the Israeli government, what would you say? Is there any magic thing that you can say? And then, when Clinton left, President Clinton left, there was a very, very tremendous, at least a substantial budget plus in the government treasury, and of course today everyone knows that what the deficit is and the tragedy of the subprime. Where is that going to lead us?
Okay. Okay, now I need a clarification. There's multiple questions there, but you wanted me to bring my wisdom from above to Israel on what policy issue? What policy am I to advise them on?
Yes,
Brain drain.
the brain drain, and improving the education so that Israelis would prefer to receive their education here, and it would be easier for Israel to attract top lecturers and professors.
Well, the higher education policy would not be the only instrument you would use. There's also, looking for your best national security, possibly peace deal, would be one. But in terms of higher education, I'm going to duck that. I'm going to leave that to you people. That was your assignment. Let's see, but now you and now subprime. Did Sever quote me on subprime? No, no, he did not. Okay, so you did subprime, and you got the Clinton deficit, the Clinton surplus in there, and the Bush deficit. Well, okay, I don't have anything that isn't obvious to say about the deficits issue. Except that America might, at the margin, actually start coming up with some extra taxes soon. That could happen a little bit, not much. Subprime crisis. I think the policy wisdom on that doesn't come from my work, but it just comes from other works that the economic historians have read well, which is, as they said about having your central bank and other policymakers worry about the stock market. And the same issue would be with the mortgage market and the subprimes. As Barry Eichengreen and others, and Peter Tamman and others have said, one of the lessons of history here for that kind of macro policy issue is keep your eye on the ball. It is the job of the regulators of the overall economy to be there when it is truly in danger of major unemployment slump and prices are even dropping and things like that. You just keep watching prices, output, unemployment. That's your task. You don't go watching as a central bank or as a government these individual markets, except that if there is some particular legislation that can make it harder to commit fraud and wrongful enticement of borrowers, as in the subprime case, pass some fine-tuning law about that. But do not imagine that that's your real policy instrument. The main policy instrument is if some particular asset market wants to have a bubble, let them have their bubble, let them crash, but we're there as soon as in the aftermath to make sure that banks have reserves, things stay open, like Greenspan did with the stock market crash in October 1987. It only was a 1 week long crash, basically, because he just made it clear there is no way that this should have any implications for bank reserves, etc. Just stay there watching the overall state of the economy and solvency, and that's that.
And
last but not least,
we have 2 mics.
Okay.
Yeah,
I only need one. Okay. I want to, since the Treasury isn't here, I want to ask 2 questions that they might ask. Okay? One is, would you feel differently about the relationship between high welfare state expenditure and growth if the high welfare state expenditure wasn't financed by high taxes but by deficits and high debt GDP ratios? That's one question. And the second is, if you were, think about a small country very dependent on foreign investment, the confidence of foreign investors that you're a well-run economic regime, and would you feel that the trade-offs would be the same as in the other the more general situation?
Yes, I feel things would be the same in both of the cases that you proposed. The second one is dependent on FDI, etc.
FDI,
foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
Sorry, incoming. FDI. Yeah. foreign direct investments, etc., it comes out much the same. The firms are not frightened away. The verdict is in. The firms do not run away from every place that has social safety nets, etc. And indeed, in many cases, it saves them the trouble. This is the way, the trap that America could get out of. General Motors could save enormous amounts of money if we would just have a single-payer public health insurance plan. General Motors is currently shifting its jobs to its own plants in Canada because, for this reason, they say, and incredibly so. So yeah, it would be the same issue, even if you were sensitive to international investment. The money just does not run like that. There are some cases. Bjorn Borg took his money to Malta. Okay, so there are cases. It does happen, but basically, it's not a big phenomenon. And your first case was, would I feel the same if the safety net expensive programs were financed by debt? Yes, I'd feel the same because that is financing them by high taxes. The high taxes just happen to come with a later generation. You might say that's a mark against the idea if that was the only way you could tax it. Yeah, I would worry a bit about that. So my worries are tempered by the fact that the later generation will be richer than us in any case, and it's kind of a redistribution from rich to poor.
Could you comment on...
No, we have to stop here. It's time to stop, I think. The paper on which Professor Lindert's presentation here can be found on our site in English, and soon to be followed in Hebrew. I think it's your first Hebrew paper. It will be our responsibility to make sure that it will be identical to the English one, but the language. And I would like to thank you very, very much for a great presentation.
Thank you for good questions.
Listening carefully. And I want to invite you all to a reception that is around the corner or upstairs? Around the corner where you had coffee before. So if you now need to upload some